The smell hit Roy Kessler before anything else, that particular cold sulfur of black muck turning in October, the kind of rot that had no bottom to it and no age you could name. He stood at the edge of the parcel at first light, 62 years old, his boots already sinking at the heel, and pressed 2 fingers into the peat to the second knuckle. He held them there. Then he wiped them on his work pants and walked back to the truck. He had driven 40 minutes from his home on Ridge Road to look at 15 acres of bottomland that no one wanted and everyone had a reason to explain. The parcel sat in a shallow depression along Burnt Fort Creek, 6 miles south of Waycross in Ware County, Georgia. It had been listed with the county for 11 months without an offer. The asking price was $4,200. Roy paid $4,100 in cash by certified check on October 14, 1983. At the closing, the seller's attorney, a man named Hutchins who kept his reading glasses on a chain, looked at the survey map and then at Roy and said, "You understand this parcel floods in any wet winter." Roy said he understood. Hutchins said, "Nothing grows in it." Roy said he'd see. Hutchins wrote down the transfer and said nothing further, and Roy drove back to Ware County with the deed folded in the glove box and his hands steady on the wheel. His wife, Dottie, sat at the kitchen table when he got home. She read the deed when he set it in front of her, all the way through, then put it down. She didn't ask him what he planned. She had watched him for 34 years and knew better than to ask before he was ready to say. But the deed was not the only instrument Roy had signed. 2 weeks before closing, he had signed a note at First National Bank of Waycross for $12,000, secured against the house on Ridge Road, the house his father had built in 1941. That note was due in 5 years. Roy's monthly income was $640 from a Georgia Forestry Commission pension, 30 years of service to the land converted to a number that left no room for error. If the 15 acres produced nothing, the bank would take the house. He knew this, and he bought the land anyway. Word moved through Ware County in the way it always does, person to person at the feed store, at the gas pump, at the post office counter. By mid-November, Virgil Hatton at Hatton Feed and Supply on Plant Avenue in Waycross had the story, and Virgil kept a mental register of every questionable decision in the county, the way a good accountant keeps a ledger. He told it at the counter with enough restraint to make it land harder. Old Roy Kessler, 62 years old, mortgaged his house on Ridge Road for 15 acres of swamp on Burnt Fort Creek. Can't drain it without an Army Corps permit. Nothing grows in it anyway. Floods every wet winter. The men who heard this agreed in the way men at feed stores agree, not loudly, just steadily. Dr. Philip Stowe ran the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Office for Ware County out of a building on Memorial Drive in Waycross. He held a doctorate in agronomy from the Athens campus and 17 years of county service, and was, by the measure of the institution that employed him, correct about most things most of the time. In December of 1983, he drove out to the Burnt Fort Creek parcel as a professional courtesy. He stood where Roy was standing, at the edge of the muck, in the thin December cold of South Georgia, and told Roy exactly what he saw. He said the parcel was classified Class VI agricultural, unsuitable for cultivation, without significant drainage infrastructure. He said the peat layer was too acidic, with pH in the 3.8 to 4.3 range, and that even if Roy could secure a permit to tile drain it, a process that would take 18 months with the Corps of Engineers, the soil, once dry, would oxidize and compact and lose the organic matter that made it feel rich. He had seen men attempt to reclaim Flatwoods bottomland in Brantley and Clinch counties both, he said, and it had not gone well for them. He said all of this without cruelty. He said it the way a man speaks when he has the data and the credentials and the institutional backing to confirm both. Roy listened to every word. He stood with his arms at his sides and his chin slightly forward, the way he stood when he was reading timber sign in a hardwood stand, patient in the way of men who already know what they are going to do. He thanked Dr. Stowe for coming out. He did not argue. He did not explain. Dr. Stowe drove back to Memorial Drive and wrote up a county consultation report, dated December 4th, 1983. The findings section read, "Parcel unsuitable for commercial agricultural development. Owner advised. No recommended intervention." 3 weeks later, at the Waycross Rotary Club holiday luncheon in a room with 22 people in it, Dr. Stowe told the story of the consultation as an example of well-meaning but misguided land speculation, a cautionary note for those tempted by cheap acreage without understanding what cheap acreage usually meant. Several of the men in that room knew Roy Kessler personally. None of them said anything in his defense. The story drew a quiet laugh, the restrained kind, which is worse than a loud one because it means everyone agrees. Roy wasn't at the luncheon. He was at the parcel, standing in the December dark, looking at the ground, his breath coming in short white pulls in the cold air. Roy's father, Clyde Kessler, had come to Ware County from Burlington County, New Jersey, in 1938, chasing work after the Depression had guttered out the packing houses. Before Burlington, the Kesslers had grown blueberries, not the low, wild kind that grew along the Georgia ridges, but highbush blueberries, Vaccinium corymbosum, the cultivated variety that required acid soil, and a managed water table and patience measured in growing seasons, not in weeks. Clyde had kept a notebook from those years. A brown cloth cover composition book, the pages water-stained at the corners, the entries written in pencil in the tight rightward slant of a man accustomed to writing in cold sheds. Roy had read it so many times the binding had softened. The notebook contained, among other things, a specific observation that Clyde had recorded in April of 1934, that the best yields on the Burlington County operations came not from fully drained fields, but from partially drained ones, fields where the water table was managed at 18 to 24 inches below root level. Too dry, and the peat compacted and lost its nitrogen cycling capacity. Too wet, and the root crowns drowned in standing water. At 18 to 24 inches, the feeder roots stayed active through the heat of July, and the fruit set dense. There was a second line, penciled alongside a cross-section sketch of soil layers. The rot smell means life below. Don't drain it out. Manage it. Roy had read that line for the first time in 1961, the year Clyde died, and he had not forgotten it in the 22 years since. What doctor? Stowe named as the fatal liability of the burnt Fort Creek parcel, its pH, its saturation, its black muck, Roy recognized as the precise conditions that highbush blueberries required. Commercial blueberry growers on upland fields spent money every year applying elemental sulfur to drop their soil pH to the 4.5 range that the crop needed. Roy was standing on 15 acres already sitting at 4.1 to 4.3. The Extension Service saw a drainage problem. Roy saw a blueberry field that hadn't been planted yet. He hadn't said any of this to Stowe. He hadn't said it to Virgil Hatton or the attorney with the glasses on a chain or anyone else in Ware County. He began drawing the tile drainage plan in January of 1984 at the kitchen table, using a straightedge and a topo map from the county surveyor's office, while the television ran in the other room and Dottie read in her chair. The Army Corps of Engineers, Savannah District, approved the drainage permit in March of 1984, 17 weeks after Roy filed the application, 2 weeks before he'd expected it. The permit authorized installation of perforated clay drain tile at 30-inch depth, discharging to the existing drainage ditch along the county road right-of-way. Roy had paid a licensed surveyor $340 to draw the drainage plan to Corps specifications, money taken from the household account. He laid the tile himself. His equipment was a 1957 Allis-Chalmers WD-45 Persian orange, which he had bought used in 1969 for $1,100 from a retiring farmer outside Homerville. He maintained it on a schedule he kept in a brown ledger hung on a finished nail inside the barn door, oil change every 200 hours of operation, valve lash inspection every 400 hours, clutch plate check each spring before field season. The WD-45 weighed 4,200 pounds and produced 42 horsepower at the drawbar, which was sufficient for the subsoil plow, and the trenching attachment Roy had bolted to the three-point hitch using fabricated adapter plates he'd welded himself in the barn in February. He worked the tile lines in April of 1984, running 4 parallel trenches at 60-foot spacing across the 15-acre parcel. He drove the WD-45 in low range with the throttle at 2/3, watching the furrow wall ahead of the trencher, feeling through the metal seat pan when the blade caught a root mass and needed coaxing. The muck was dense. It closed back behind the blade almost immediately. On a good morning, he made 100 linear feet of trench. On a morning when the soil was saturated from overnight rain, he made 60. Dottie came out on the third Saturday with a measuring tape and walked the completed runs to check grade. She recorded the measurements in a spiral notebook she kept in her coat pocket and didn't say anything except the numbers. By June of 1984, Roy checked the water table depth with a slotted PVC standpipe he'd driven into the muck at the center of the field, a $6 piece of hardware store pipe, marked at 1-inch intervals with a paint pen and capped with a loose wooden plug to keep out debris. He lowered a weighted measuring line to the water surface and read the depth, 26 inches, 2 inches past his target ceiling. He adjusted the tile outlets in July, throttling 2 of the 4 discharge ends with plain cedar plugs, slowing the drainage rate. By August, the standpipe read 22 inches. He left it there and wrote the number in the ledger. That fall, he planted 1,200 blueberry starts across 6 acres, Tifblue variety, the commercial highbush cultivar the University of Georgia had released for coastal plain production in 1955. He set them at 4 feet in the row, 8 feet between rows, and paid 62 cents per plant from a nursery in Alma, Georgia, for a total of $744. He mulched each plant with 4 inches of pine bark, tamped it flat against the cane with his boot, and moved on. The work took 12 days. Then he waited. Virgil Hatton at the feed store heard about the blueberry planting by November. He said it was the second worst decision he'd heard of in connection with that parcel, the first being the purchase. The men at the counter agreed in the usual manner. The winter of 1984 into 1985 delivered 11 inches of rain to Ware County in December alone. Burnt Fort Creek ran bankfull for 3 consecutive weeks. The low fields along the county road flooded to their fence lines. Roy drove out on a Wednesday morning in January and stood at the edge of his parcel in the gray flat light and listened. He could hear the tile outlets discharging into the roadside ditch, a steady, pressured pour. He lowered the measuring line into the standpipe. 31 inches, too deep. The young blueberry plants stood with their root crowns exposed in the upper peat, not drowned but stressed, their canes dark and still in the cold air. He opened both cedar plugs that afternoon fully to accelerate drainage. He returned 4 days later, 27 inches, 3 days after that, 23. He drove home and wrote the sequence in the ledger with the dates and the weather note. 47 plants died that winter. He found them in March, a 12-foot section of row where the drainage had lagged and the root crowns had sat in cold standing water 3 days too long. He replaced them in April. 47 plants at 62 cents, $29.14. He recorded the loss, the location, the cause, and the solution, adjusted plug angle on that section's outlet, and moved on. Dr. Stowe drove past the parcel in April of 1985 on his way to a farm call in Clinch County. He slowed the truck to look. The Tifblue start stood 12 inches tall at their tallest, their new growth tips a pale red-green in the April light. From the road, moving at 15 miles an hour, they looked like nothing. He did not stop. That same month, Roy wrote to the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service requesting any published research on highbush blueberry culture in Flatwoods organic soils. The reply came back in a form letter with a pamphlet on Bahiagrass management enclosed. No relevant publications on file for that soil type. He filed the letter and the pamphlet in a manila folder and set it on the barn shelf. He had his father's notebook. He did not need the pamphlet. By August of 1985, the Tifblue plants on the 6-acre planting stood between 18 and 24 inches tall, faster second-year growth than upland plantings typically showed, consistent with a note in Clyde's composition book from 1934. In heavy peat below drainage, second-year cane is faster than upland. Nitrogen release continuous from organic substrate. Roy measured 6 random plants with a cloth tape and recorded the heights. He stood in the row with one hand flat against a cane for a moment, feeling the firmness and the green cold of it, and then walked back to the truck without a word to anyone. The summer of 1986 nearly ended it. The second winter had been dry enough, and the plants had come through with minimal loss. But in June, Roy noticed iron chlorosis developing across the northern 2 acres, leaves yellowing between the veins in the pattern that indicated iron or manganese lockout. The pH was right, the drainage was right. He spent 3 weeks in his father's notebook and in the Waycross Public Library reading whatever he could locate on soil chemistry in saturated organics. The problem was dissolved oxygen. In the wettest section of the northern tile run, the soil went periodically anaerobic during wet spring periods, locking iron into forms the plant roots could not absorb. The answer he arrived at would have appeared backward to any trained agronomist. He installed a surface aeration modification on the northern tile outlets, using perforated PVC return lines to introduce ambient air into the drainage layer during wet weather flow events. The system cost $218 in hardware and a week of hand labor. By August, the chlorosis had begun to green out. By October, the northern 2 acres were indistinguishable from the rest of the planting. He wrote the solution in the ledger with the date and the materials cost. He did not call the extension office. In May of 1987, Roy harvested his first commercial crop from the original 6 acres. He began picking at 5:30 each morning, when the fruit was still cool from the night and the dew sat silver on the leaves. The Tifblue berries were deep blue-black, firm at the stem, slightly yielding at the belly, the quality a fresh market packer wanted. He rented a used flat-belt mechanical sorter from a produce equipment dealer in Valdosta at $400 for the season. Dottie ran the sorter while Roy picked and hauled. They worked 6 days a week across 3 weeks of peak harvest. He sold to a packer in Jessup at 42 cents per pound fresh market price, not processing grade. Total yield from 6 acres, 14,600 pounds. Per acre yield, 2,433 pounds, against the county's published extension average of 1,800 pounds per acre on upland cultivated fields. Roy took the settlement check, $6,132, and drove it to First National Bank of Waycross and applied it to the note. At the counter, he said the account number and nothing else. The teller, a woman named Mrs. Crabb, who had worked that window for years, looked at the check and looked at him and said, "That's good." Roy said it was a start. He drove home and planted the remaining 9 acres that fall, the wet western section he'd held back until the aeration modification had proven out. 2,040 new plants at 62 cents each, paid from the harvest check. The house on Ridge Road was not out of danger yet, but the trajectory had changed. Virgil Hatton heard the yield number from a produce broker in Jessup before Thanksgiving. He stood behind his feed store counter and said the number had to be wrong. No one pulled 2,400 pounds per acre from Flatwood's bottomland. He said this with the same evenness he'd used in 1983, the same certainty, the same tone of a man reading from a ledger that hadn't been updated in 4 years. In April of 1988, Dr. Philip Stowe drove out to Burnt Fort Creek on a Tuesday morning and parked on the county road shoulder. He walked to the field edge in his extension khakis, carrying a clipboard he did not write on. The Tifblue canes stood 6 and 7 feet tall in their 4th and 5th leaf, the fruit set thick on the 2-year wood, the rows running straight across the black peat. The morning light came in low from the east and caught the dew on the leaves, and the whole field held a quality of light that had no agricultural category for it. It simply looked like work that had been right from the beginning. Roy was at the near end of the closest row when Stowe walked in, a half-bushel basket in one hand and his work gloves tucked under his arm. He was pressing each berry cluster lightly with his fingers to test firmness, the way his father had shown him in Burlington County, before Burlington County was anything but a story. Stowe walked to the row edge and stopped. He said, "I was wrong about this parcel." Roy looked at him. He said, "I know." Stowe said, "The drainage system, the way you managed the water table." Roy said, "It was my father's idea, mostly." Stowe looked down the row for a long moment. He said, "I should have asked more questions in 1983. Roy didn't answer that. He put on his gloves and turned back to the cane. Stowe stood there another minute and then walked to his truck. He sat in the truck with the engine off before he drove away. That same week, a letter arrived from First National Bank of Waycross, a form notice, sent to performing accounts, confirming that the note secured against the Ridge Road property was current and in good standing. Roy read it at the kitchen table, folded it once, and set it in the document box on the barn shelf. In November of 1988, a woman named Gloria Jean Marsh filed a formal complaint with the University of Georgia's Office of Research and Extension against the Ware County Extension Service, alleging that a consultation report for her timber property had recommended against a management practice that a licensed forester subsequently confirmed as viable. Her attorney, in the course of building the case, requested a sample of consultation records from the Ware County office going back 5 years. Roy's December 1983 report, the one that read parcel unsuitable for commercial agricultural development, owner advised, no recommended intervention, was in the packet. By the time the internal review panel reached Dr. Stowe's consultation files, Roy's 15-acre operation was producing 41,000 pounds of blueberries per year. That figure was in the public agricultural record. Roy had filed a USDA farm registration in 1988 when he applied for federal crop insurance, and the yield data was attached. The review panel, which included an agronomist from the UGA Tifton Research Campus, examined the 1983 consultation report and the field outcomes and concluded, in a written memo dated March 1989, that the original assessment had failed to account for the specific mineral and biological properties of coastal plain flatwoods peat in relation to ericaceous crop culture. The memo recommended that extension agents in counties containing similar soil formations receive supplemental training, and that the Flatwoods Bottomland Assessment Protocol be revised to include ericaceous crop suitability screening before issuing an unsuitable determination. Dr. Stowe was not dismissed. He was reassigned in June of 1989 to a research coordination role at the Athens campus, removed from county field consultation work, moved to a desk. He published a paper in 1991 in the Georgia Journal of Agricultural Research titled Limitations of Standard Drainage First Protocols for Coastal Plain Bottomland Assessment. The paper cited, with attribution and with Dottie's written consent, the water table management methods Roy had developed at Burnt Fort Creek. It did not use Roy's name. Dottie had asked that it not. The paper was referenced in revised extension guidelines distributed to 23 coastal plain counties in Georgia in 1992. By 1990, 2 other producers in Ware and Pierce counties had asked Roy's permission to walk the field and study the drainage logs. He showed them the tile layout, the standpipe, the ledger entries. He showed them the cedar plug adjustment system at the outlets and the aeration modification on the northern run. He did not summarize or conclude anything for them. He let them read what was in the ledger and look at what was in the field. One of them, Dan Stuckey, ran a vegetable operation in Blackshear in Pierce County. He converted 11 acres of Flatwoods bottomland to Tifblue production in 1990 using the water table management protocol Roy had worked out across 5 years of measurement. His first commercial harvest came in 1993, 2,180 pounds per acre. He called Roy the evening that Jessup Packer settled the account. Roy said, "Good numbers." Dan said, "Couldn't have done it without the ledger." Roy said, "You could have. It would have taken you 4 or 5 years to work it out." Dan said, "I didn't have 4 or 5 years." Roy said, "Most people don't. That's why someone has to do it first. By 1994, 9 operations in the two-county area were running managed water table protocols on bottomland parcels that the Extension Service had previously classified as unsuitable for cultivation. None of those operators had ever met Clyde Kessler or held the brown composition notebook in their hands. The method had moved through the community without the name attached to it, the way practical knowledge always travels, not by attribution but by result. Roy continued to check the standpipe. He continued to record the measurements. In July of 2001, Roy's grandson Marcus was 17 and working the harvest rows with a half-bushel basket and gloves folded under one arm, starting at 5:30 in the morning the way Roy always had. Marcus was the kind of 17-year-old who asked questions when he needed to understand something and kept quiet when he didn't, which Roy had always respected in a person. One morning, Marcus stood at the WD-45, the old Alley's Chalmers, still Persian orange, though the paint had thinned to primer in patches across the hood and down both fenders, and asked why Roy kept it running when modern equipment could be rented by the day from the equipment dealer in Waycross. Roy was greasing the front axle pivot. He did not look up, he said, because I know what this machine will do. A rented machine, I only know what the brochure says. Marcus said, the new ones are more powerful. Roy said, power isn't the variable. He capped the grease fitting and stood, one hand on the tire for balance. He walked Marcus to the standpipe at the center of the field, the same PVC pipe, replaced twice for length but always driven at the same location, the markings still in paint pen, the wooden plug still loose-fitted on top. He lowered the weighted measuring line to the water surface and read the depth out loud. 21 inches. He said, write that down. Marcus wrote it in the ledger. He was the third person to make a regular entry in that ledger, after Roy and after Dottie, who had started writing the weekly measurements in 1985 when Roy's back was giving him difficulty in the early mornings. Dottie's entries were smaller than Roy's, the numbers aligned with more precision. Roy said, when I'm not here, you check this standpipe every week from April through September. You don't let it go above 24 or below 18. Marcus said, what happens if it goes outside that? Roy said, you lose yield or you lose roots. Either way you lose time, and time is the one thing this crop won't give back to you. He handed Marcus the ledger and walked back to the tractor. The ledger contained 347 weekly measurements at that point, beginning April of 1984, with gaps only for 3 weeks in the winter of 1993, when Roy had been in the hospital in Waycross for a heart valve repair. Dottie had kept the entries current during those 3 weeks, driving the parcel alone in the truck before sunrise, lowering the measuring line, writing the number in the column in her smaller, more precise hand. Marcus kept the ledger and kept the schedule. In the years after Roy died, in January of 2008, Marcus checked the standpipe every week from April through September without exception, and recorded the measurements in the same columns, with the same painted markings on the replacement PVC, at the same location in the center of the field. He understood by then what his grandfather had understood in October of 1983 when he pressed 2 fingers into the black muck and held them there, that the knowledge was not in the result. The knowledge was in the measurement. And the measurement was only worth anything if you kept making it, week after week, season after season, long after anyone else had stopped watching. The 15 acres along Burnt Fort Creek still produce. The peat in the lowest section runs 3 feet deep now, deeper than the 26 inches Roy measured in 1984 because the managed water table has allowed the organic layer to accumulate rather than oxidize and collapse the way Dr. Stowe said it would. The Tifblue canes in the original 6-acre block are more than 40 years old, which is 20 years past the expected commercial lifespan of a highbush planting. They still set fruit. The WD-45 is in the barn on Ridge Road under a canvas tarp. Marcus starts it twice a year to keep the cylinders from seizing. He changes the oil on the same schedule Roy kept, using the same oil weights Roy specified in the ledger, and the ledger records which weight the machine has taken each season since 1969. The composition notebook, Clyde's brown cloth cover, water-stained at the corners, sits in a metal document box on the shelf above the ledger. The pencil entries are still legible. The sketch of the soil cross-section is still clear. The line about the rot smell and what to do about it is still there, written in the tight rightward slant of a man who wrote in a cold shed in Burlington County, New Jersey, in a year when no one had enough and everyone was watching what grew and what didn't. Roy Kessler paid $4,100 for 15 acres of Ware County bottomland that no one else wanted, signed a $12,000 note against the only house his family had ever owned, and spent 5 years working a drainage system in black muck that the county's official agricultural authority had declared, in writing, unsuitable for cultivation. What he had was not luck. What he had was his father's handwriting in a cold notebook, a measurement he trusted more than an expert's opinion, and the discipline to keep working without explaining himself until the field said what he already knew. What came out of that soil was not a surprise to Roy Kessler. It was a confirmation, and there is a difference between those two things that matters more than most people, in most circumstances, ever get to understand.